Anna Müller pressed her trembling hands against her swollen belly as the American soldiers surrounded her village, her worst fears becoming reality in the dying days of World War II. She was 9 months pregnant, alone, and certain that capture meant death for both her and her unborn child. But when the labor pains struck in that cold barn, something extraordinary happened that would shatter every assumption she had about the enemy. Lieutenant Richard Collins didn't see a German woman in distress. He saw a mother in desperate need of help, and what happened next would prove that even in humanity's darkest hour, compassion could triumph over conflict. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of April 15th, 1945, dawned gray and bitter over the small German village of Kleinfeld, nestled in the rolling hills of Bavaria. Anna Müller stood at her kitchen window, watching the smoke rise from distant fires as the thunder of artillery grew closer with each passing hour. Her hands instinctively moved to her belly, where her child kicked restlessly, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them both. At 24 years old, Anna had already lived through more hardship than most people experience in a lifetime. Her husband Wilhelm had been drafted into the Wehrmacht 3 years earlier, and hadn't been heard from since the disastrous retreat from Stalingrad. Her parents had died in an Allied bombing raid on Munich the previous summer, leaving her completely alone in a world that seemed determined to tear itself apart. The baby inside her was due any day now, and Anna had been praying desperately that she would have time to give birth safely before the advancing American forces reached their village. She had heard terrible stories from refugees fleeing west, tales of summary executions, mass deportations, and civilians disappearing forever into prisoner-of-war camps. The propaganda broadcasts had painted the Americans as ruthless barbarians who showed no mercy to German civilians, especially women. Anna's neighbor, Frau Wagner, had fled 2 days earlier with her 3 children, begging Anna to come with them. But Anna was too heavily pregnant to make the journey, and besides, where could she go? The entire country was collapsing around them. Every road was clogged with refugees, every city was being bombed, and every village was either occupied or about to be overrun. So Anna had stayed, hiding what little food she had left, and praying that somehow she and her baby would survive whatever was coming. The sound of engines broke through her thoughts, growing steadily louder until it seemed to shake the very foundations of her small house. Anna peered through the curtains and felt her heart stop. A convoy of American military vehicles was rolling down the main street of Kleinfeld, their olive-green paint and white stars stark against the morning gloom. Soldiers jumped out of the trucks, their boots hitting the cobblestones with sharp metallic clicks. They moved with practiced efficiency, spreading out through the village in small groups, checking each building systematically. Anna could hear doors being kicked in, voices shouting commands in English, and the occasional sound of breaking glass. Anna backed away from the window, her mind racing. Should she hide in the cellar? Should she try to run? But even as these thoughts crossed her mind, she knew it was hopeless. She was too pregnant to run far, and there was nowhere to hide that they wouldn't eventually find her. A sharp knock on her front door made her jump. Then, the knocking became pounding, and she heard a man's voice shouting something in English. Anna's limited knowledge of the language, learned from her school days before the war, was barely enough to understand that they were ordering her to open the door. With trembling hands, she unlatched the lock and slowly pulled the door open. 3 American soldiers stood on her doorstep, their rifles held ready, but not directly pointed at her. The one in front, who appeared to be an officer based on his insignia, looked to be in his early 30s, with kind blue eyes and sandy brown hair visible beneath his helmet. "Good morning, ma'am," the officer said in careful, slow English, clearly trying to make himself understood. "I am Lieutenant Richard Collins, United States Army. We need to ask you some questions." Anna stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. She had expected shouting, violence, immediate arrest. Instead, this young officer was speaking to her with something that almost resembled respect. I speak little English," Anna managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, I am alone. I have no weapons. I am not political." Lieutenant Collins studied her face for a moment, and Anna saw his expression soften as he took in her obvious pregnancy and frightened demeanor. He turned to one of the other soldiers, a short, stocky man with sergeant's stripes, and said something in rapid English that Anna couldn't follow. The sergeant nodded and walked away, leaving Collins and the third soldier, a young private who couldn't have been more than 19 years old. Collins looked back at Anna and attempted a reassuring smile. "We are not here to hurt you," he said slowly, pronouncing each word carefully. "But all civilians must be questioned. It is, how do you say, procedure. Do you understand?" Anna nodded, though she wasn't sure if she believed him. Everything she had been told about the Americans suggested that their idea of questioning might involve torture or worse. But Collins seemed genuinely concerned about not frightening her further. "May we come in?" Collins asked. "It is cold outside, and you should not stand in the wind in your condition." The fact that he had asked permission, rather than simply pushing past her, caught Anna off guard. Reluctantly, she stepped aside and gestured for them to enter. The two soldiers removed their helmets as they came inside, another small courtesy that surprised her. Collins looked around the modest interior of Anna's house, taking in the simple furniture, the few family photographs on the mantelpiece, and the obvious signs of wartime privation. Everything was clean and well kept, but there was very little of anything. No luxury items, no signs of wealth or political connections, just the bare necessities of life during wartime. "What is your name?" Collins asked, settling himself carefully in one of Anna's wooden chairs. Anna Müller," she replied, remaining standing despite the increasing discomfort in her lower back. "Please, sit down," Collins said, gesturing toward another chair. "You should not stand so long." Anna hesitated, then slowly lowered herself into the chair, grateful for the relief it provided. The baby had been particularly active that morning, and she was beginning to feel the first twinges of what might have been early labor pains. "Your husband?" Collins asked gently. "Where is he?" "Dead," Anna said simply, though she had no proof of this. "Soldier. Russia. 3 years now, no word." Collins nodded sympathetically. He had seen too many war widows in the past few months. Women left alone to face an uncertain future, while their men died on distant battlefields. It was one of the things about this war that had begun to wear on him, the realization that suffering knew no nationality. "Any other family?" "No. All dead. Bombing." Anna's voice was flat, emotionless. She had learned to speak of these losses without breaking down, though the pain was always there just beneath the surface. The young private, who had been standing silently by the door, suddenly stepped forward and said something urgently to Collins in English. Anna caught only a few words, but the tone suggested some kind of problem. Collins frowned and stood up. "I must go outside for a moment," he told Anna. "Please stay here. We will return soon." Anna watched through the window as Collins and the private joined a group of soldiers who had gathered in the village square. There seemed to be some kind of disagreement or discussion taking place, with several men talking at once and pointing in different directions. Left alone in her house, Anna tried to calm her racing thoughts. So far, the Americans had been far more civil than she had expected, but she knew that could change at any moment. She had heard stories of soldiers who seemed friendly at first, only to turn violent when they didn't get the answers they wanted. A sharp pain in her abdomen made her gasp and grip the arm of her chair. It was stronger than the twinges she had been feeling earlier, and it lasted for nearly 30 seconds before subsiding. Anna's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. After 9 long months of waiting and worrying, her baby had chosen this moment, of all moments, to begin its journey into the world. Another contraction followed 5 minutes later, then another. Anna tried to time them, but her mind was too scattered by fear and adrenaline to focus properly. All she knew was that they were getting stronger and closer together with each passing minute. When Collins returned to the house 20 minutes later, he found Anna doubled over in her chair, breathing hard and clearly in distress. His medical training from basic training was limited, but he had seen enough battlefield injuries to recognize when someone was in serious physical distress. "Mrs. Müller? What is wrong?" he asked, moving quickly to her side. Anna looked up at him with frightened eyes. "Baby," she gasped between contractions. Baby is coming. Now. Collins felt his stomach drop. Of all the complications he had prepared for during this deployment, delivering a baby in an occupied German village had not been one of them. He looked around the small house, as if hoping to find a doctor or midwife hiding somewhere in the shadows. "How long?" he asked, though he wasn't sure Anna understood the question. Anna held up her hand, fingers spread wide. "Minutes apart," she managed to say in broken English. "Very pain." Collins made a quick decision. He turned to the private, who had been watching the scene with wide, alarmed eyes. "Roberts, go find Sergeant Martinez immediately. Tell him we need the medic, and we need someone who speaks better German than I do, and see if we have any women with the unit, anyone with nursing experience." Private Roberts nodded and ran from the house as if his life depended on it. Collins turned back to Anna, who was gripping the chair so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "It will be okay," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "Help is coming." Anna looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. You help me? But I am German. Enemy." Collins met her eyes steadily. "You are a woman about to have a baby. That makes you a mother first. Everything else, second." The simple humanity in his words broke through the wall of fear and suspicion that Anna had built around herself. For the first time since the soldiers had arrived, she allowed herself to believe that she and her baby might actually survive this day. Another contraction hit, stronger than the previous ones, and Anna couldn't suppress a cry of pain. Collins looked around the house again, his military training kicking in as he tried to assess what resources they had available. "We need to move you somewhere more comfortable," he said. "Bedroom?" Anna shook her head. "No bed. Sold for food last winter." Collins cursed under his breath. The war had stripped these people of everything, even the basic necessities for bringing new life into the world. He thought quickly, then had an idea. "There is a barn behind your house, yes? With hay straw?" Anna nodded, not sure where he was going with this. "Straw is clean, soft, better than hard floor, and more private. What do you think?" The practicality of the suggestion made sense to Anna. Even through the fog of pain and fear, the barn would be warmer than the house, which had no fuel for heating, and the straw would indeed be softer than her wooden floors. "Yes," she agreed, "but I cannot walk far." "You will not have to," Collins assured her. Just then, Roberts returned with Sergeant Martinez and 2 other soldiers, one of whom was carrying what appeared to be a medical kit. Collins quickly explained the situation to his men. Martinez, the seasoned NCO who had seen combat in North Africa and Italy, took the news in stride. "Well, Lieutenant, I've seen stranger things in this war. What do you need from us?" "Help me move Mrs. Müller to the barn behind the house. Roberts, go find blankets, clean cloth, anything that might be useful, and keep looking for someone with medical training, preferably female." The soldiers moved with surprising gentleness, helping Anna to her feet and supporting her as she walked slowly through the house and out the back door. The barn was small but sturdy, with a loft full of straw and hay that created a relatively warm and private space. As they were settling Anna onto a makeshift bed of straw covered with Collins's own army blanket, Private Roberts returned with news that made Collins's heart leap with relief. "Sir, there's an army nurse with a supply convoy that just arrived in the village square. Sergeant Kowalski is bringing her over now." Within minutes, a capable-looking woman in her 30s entered the barn, carrying a proper medical bag and wearing the confident demeanor of someone who had dealt with medical emergencies under difficult conditions. She introduced herself as Helen Thompson, and Anna felt another surge of hope as she realized that this woman might actually know what she was doing. Helen quickly assessed the situation, checking Anna's pulse and asking questions in surprisingly good German. It turned out she had grown up in a German-speaking household in Wisconsin and had volunteered for overseas duty partly because of her language skills. "How far apart are the contractions?" Helen asked Anna in fluent German. 3, maybe 4 minutes, Anna replied, relief evident in her voice at finally being able to communicate clearly with someone who understood her situation. Helen nodded professionally. "This baby is definitely coming today. Lieutenant Collins did the right thing moving you here. We'll have more privacy and space to work." She turned to Collins, who had been standing uncertainly by the barn door. "I'm going to need hot water, clean towels or cloth, and someone to stand guard outside to make sure we're not interrupted. Can you arrange that?" Collins nodded immediately. "Consider it done. What else?" "Pray that everything goes normally," Helen said with a slight smile. "I've delivered babies before, but never under quite these circumstances." Over the next hour, as Anna's labor progressed, an extraordinary transformation took place in and around the small barn. American soldiers, who had come to Kleinfeld as occupying forces, found themselves transformed into protectors and helpers, ensuring that a German woman could safely bring her child into the world. Sergeant Martinez organized a perimeter around the barn, not to keep Anna in, but to keep curious soldiers and any remaining villagers out. Private Roberts made multiple trips between the barn and the village well, carrying buckets of water that other soldiers heated over small fires. 2 more medics arrived from other units, bringing additional supplies and expertise. Inside the barn, Helen worked with calm efficiency, while Anna labored with increasing intensity. Collins had initially planned to leave once professional medical help arrived, but Helen had asked him to stay, partly for translation purposes, and partly because Anna seemed comforted by his presence. "She trusts you," Helen had explained quietly. "In a situation like this, that's worth more than extra medical equipment." As the afternoon wore on, Anna found herself in the surreal position of being cared for by the very people she had been taught to fear most. The American soldiers treated her not as a defeated enemy, but as any woman in labor deserved to be treated, with respect, concern, and practical help. During a brief lull between contractions, Anna managed to ask Collins a question that had been troubling her. "Why do you help me? I am nothing to you." Collins considered his answer carefully. "My wife is pregnant too," he said finally. "Back in Ohio, our first child. She is due next month. I keep thinking, if something happened to me, if the situation were reversed, I would hope that someone would help her the way we are helping you." This revelation added another layer of meaning to the day's events. Collins wasn't just acting out of general humanitarian impulses. He was seeing Anna as he would want his own wife to be seen, as a person deserving of care and protection regardless of the political circumstances. That had brought them together. As the sun began to set, Anna's contractions became almost continuous, and Helen announced that it was time for the final stage of labor. The barn fell silent except for Anna's breathing and Helen's quiet, encouraging words. Collins stood near the barn door, facing outward to give Anna privacy while remaining close enough to help if needed. Outside, he could see several of his men standing in a loose circle around the barn, their rifles held casually but ready, creating a protective barrier around the miracle taking place inside. It struck Collins as profoundly symbolic that in the final days of a war that had consumed Europe for 6 years, American soldiers were standing guard not to prevent life, but to protect it. The irony was not lost on him that they had crossed an ocean and fought their way across a continent to be present at this moment, helping to bring new life into a world that had seen far too much death. At precisely 7:23 that evening, as the first stars became visible through the open barn door, Anna Müller's baby entered the world with a strong, healthy cry that seemed to echo across the entire village. Helen held up the infant, a perfectly formed little girl, and announced in both German and English, "You have a daughter, and she is beautiful." Anna began to cry, not from pain or fear, but from overwhelming relief and joy. For 9 months, she had worried that her child would be born into a world where they had no place, no future, no hope. Instead, her daughter had arrived, surrounded by people who had risked their own safety and comfort to ensure she had the best possible chance at life. Collins felt tears in his own eyes as he watched Helen place the baby in Anna's arms. The sight of mother and child together, safe and healthy despite everything that had happened, seemed to justify every mile they had marched and every risk they had taken to get to this place. Outside the barn, word of the birth spread quickly through the American unit. Soldiers who had been preparing for possible combat found themselves instead celebrating the arrival of a new life. Several of them had children of their own back home, and the sight of their comrades helping to deliver a baby reminded them of what they were ultimately fighting for: the right of all people to live and raise their families in peace. Sergeant Martinez, who had been maintaining the security perimeter, allowed himself a rare smile as he listened to the baby's cries. "Well, I'll be damned," he said to Private Roberts. "In 36 years on this earth, I've seen a lot of strange things, but I never thought I'd be standing guard over a German woman giving birth." Roberts, who was barely 21 himself, nodded in amazement. "My mom always said babies have a way of bringing out the best in people. I guess she was right, even in the middle of a war." Inside the barn, Helen was conducting the routine post-birth procedures, checking both mother and baby for any complications. Everything appeared to be normal and healthy, which was something of a miracle, given the circumstances and the limited medical resources available. Anna looked up at Collins, who had remained discreetly near the barn door throughout the birth. "How can I thank you?" she asked in German, which Helen translated. Collins thought for a moment, then replied, "Take good care of her. Raise her to be better than we were. Make sure she knows that people can choose to help each other, even when their countries tell them they should be enemies." So, when Helen translated these words, Anna nodded seriously. She understood that her daughter had been born not just into a new world, but into a new kind of possibility, one where nationality and politics might matter less than simple human decency. As the evening deepened, practical questions began to assert themselves. What would happen to Anna and her baby now? Would they be sent to a displacement camp? Would they be allowed to stay in their village? Would there be enough food and medical care available as Germany struggled to rebuild from the devastation of war? Collins had been thinking about these same questions. While he couldn't make policy decisions that affected the entire occupation, he could use his authority as a local commander to ensure that Anna and her daughter received the protection and assistance they needed in the immediate term. "Mrs. Müller will remain in her home for now," he announced to his men. "We'll make sure she has adequate food and medical care. If anyone has questions about this decision, they can discuss it with me personally." This declaration was met with nods of approval from the soldiers present. They had all been part of something extraordinary that day, and none of them wanted to see it end with Anna and her baby being herded off to an uncertain fate in a refugee camp. Over the following days, as word of the birth spread through the American unit and the remaining German villagers, it became clear that the event had created a bond between former enemies that transcended the usual boundaries of military occupation. American soldiers began stopping by Anna's house to check on her and the baby, bringing extra food rations, blankets, and other supplies. Some of them had medical training and were able to monitor the health of both mother and child. Others simply wanted to see the little girl who had, in some indefinable way, made them feel more human in the midst of an inhuman war. Anna named her daughter Hope, a choice that seemed perfect to everyone who heard the story. The baby had indeed represented hope, hope that people could rise above the hatred and division that had torn Europe apart, hope that the future might be better than the past, hope that her generation might be the one to finally break the cycle of war and revenge that had defined European history for so many centuries. Lieutenant Collins continued to visit regularly, partly out of a sense of responsibility, and partly because he had genuinely grown fond of Anna and her daughter. Anna's English improved rapidly during these visits, and she began to learn more about Collins's life back in Ohio, his pregnant wife Sarah, and his dreams for the future. In return, Anna shared stories of her life before the war, her marriage to Wilhelm, the hopes and dreams that had sustained her through the darkest years of the conflict. These conversations helped both of them understand that the propaganda they had been fed about each other was largely false. Americans were not the savage barbarians that German propaganda had portrayed, and Germans were not the fanatical monsters that Allied propaganda sometimes suggested. 3 weeks after Hope's birth, Collins received news that would change everything. His unit was being transferred to another sector, and he would be leaving Kleinfeld within a few days. The news hit Anna harder than she had expected. Collins had become not just a protector, but something approaching a friend, one of the few stable elements in her life during a time of tremendous uncertainty. The night before his departure, Collins made one final visit to Anna's house. He found her sitting by the window, holding Hope, and looking out at the village that was slowly beginning to rebuild itself. "I have something for you," Collins said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small photograph of his wife Sarah, taken just before he had left for Europe. "When my daughter is born, I want her to know about hope. I want both girls to know that their fathers met because of them, and that sometimes enemies can become friends." Anna took the photograph with trembling hands. Sarah looked young and hopeful, with kind eyes that reminded Anna of her husband's. "I will keep this always," she promised. "And I will tell Hope about the American soldiers who helped her come into the world." Collins nodded, then reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small wooden toy, a horse that one of his men had carved during their long evenings in the village. "For when she's older," he said simply. As Collins prepared to leave, Anna struggled to find words adequate to express what his actions had meant to her. Finally, she settled on something simple but profound. "You gave my daughter life," she said. "I will never forget this." Collins smiled and touched his cap in a small salute. "Take care of yourself, Anna. Take care of Hope. Make the future better than the past." After he left, Anna sat in the darkness of her small house, holding her sleeping daughter and thinking about the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she would never have imagined that American soldiers could show such kindness to a German woman. 6 months ago, she had been preparing for death. Now she was preparing for life, for hope, for a future that seemed genuinely possible for the first time in years. The story of Hope's birth became legendary in the American unit, passed down from soldier to soldier as they moved across Germany and eventually back to the United States. For many of them, it became a defining memory of their time in the war, a reminder that even in the midst of humanity's worst impulses, individual acts of kindness and compassion could still shine through. Collins returned home to Ohio in late 1945 and was present for the birth of his own daughter, whom he and Sarah named Anna in honor of the German woman who had taught him that the capacity for goodness knows no nationality. He often told the story of Hope's birth to his family and friends, always emphasizing that war could not erase the fundamental humanity that connected all people. Anna and Hope remained in Kleinfeld as Germany slowly rebuilt itself from the ruins of war. The village became part of the American occupation zone, and Anna was able to establish relationships with other American personnel who passed through over the years. She learned English fluently and eventually found work as a translator and cultural liaison, helping to bridge the gap between German civilians and American administrators. Hope grew up bilingual and bicultural in a way that would have been impossible before the war. She learned about American democracy and German history, about the importance of individual conscience and the dangers of blind obedience to authority. Most importantly, she learned that people from different countries and cultures could work together, help each other, and even become friends, despite the political divisions that separated their governments. As the years passed and Hope became a young woman, Anna would often tell her the story of her birth, emphasizing not just the kindness of the American soldiers, but the broader lesson about humanity's capacity for good, even in the darkest circumstances. "You were born into a world at war," Anna would say, "but you were brought into life by people who chose peace over conflict, compassion over hatred. That choice is always available to every person in every generation. Your job is to keep choosing it and to help others make the same choice." Hope took these lessons to heart and eventually became a teacher, dedicating her life to educating young people about history, languages, and the importance of understanding between nations. She never forgot the story of her birth, and she made sure that her own children and students understood the profound truth it contained about the possibility of human goodness in even the most difficult circumstances. The barn where Hope was born became something of a local landmark in Kleinfeld. Anna made sure it was preserved and maintained, and she would sometimes bring visitors there to tell the story of that extraordinary day in April 1945. The building served as a physical reminder that in the final analysis, the things that unite humanity, our common needs, hopes, and capacity for compassion, are stronger than the things that divide us. Lieutenant Collins and Anna maintained a correspondence for many years after the war, exchanging letters and photographs as their daughters grew up on opposite sides of the Atlantic. The friendship that had begun in a moment of crisis continued and deepened, serving as a personal bridge between two countries that had learned to become allies and partners rather than enemies. In 1965, 20 years after Hope's birth, Collins and his family made a trip to Germany and visited Anna and Hope in Kleinfeld. The reunion was emotional for everyone involved, but especially meaningful for the two daughters, Anna Collins and Hope Müller, who had been connected by their father's friendship since before they were born. The two young women, now in their 20s, found they had much in common despite growing up in different countries. Both had been raised with a deep appreciation for the importance of international friendship and understanding. Both had been taught that their own existence was somehow connected to a moment when people chose to help rather than harm, to build rather than destroy. During that visit, Collins and Anna walked together to the barn where Hope had been born. The building was exactly as they remembered it, though it now seemed smaller and less dramatic than it had on that life-changing day 2 decades earlier. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had made different choices that day? Anna asked as they stood in the doorway where Collins had once kept watch. Collins considered the question seriously. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "But I always come back to the same conclusion. We didn't really make a choice that day. When you see someone in need, especially someone bringing life into the world, there's only one thing you can do if you want to remain human." Anna nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "Hope always asks me if I was afraid that day, afraid that you might hurt us. I tell her yes. I was terrified, but I was more afraid of being alone, of facing the birth without help. When you offered help, when you treated me like a person rather than an enemy, you gave me more than just medical assistance. You gave me back my faith in people." As they walked back toward the village, Collins reflected on how different the world had become since Hope's birth. Germany was now a prosperous democracy, a key ally of the United States. The two countries that had been locked in mortal combat were now partners in building a more peaceful world. Children who had been born as enemies were now friends, and their friendship was helping to ensure that such a war would never happen again. The story of Hope's birth had become more than just a personal memory for Collins and Anna. It had become a symbol of the possibility of reconciliation, of the power of individual human decency to transcend political divisions and historical grievances. In a world that often seemed determined to repeat the mistakes of the past, it served as a reminder that people could choose differently, that they could reach across boundaries of nationality, ideology, and history to help one another in times of need. Hope herself grew up to embody these lessons in her own life and work. She became a prominent advocate for international exchange programs, helping to facilitate connections between young Americans and Germans that would ensure the friendship between the two countries continued into future generations. She often spoke at schools and universities about the importance of seeing the humanity in people who might seem like enemies, drawing on the story of her own birth as the most powerful example she could provide. The barn in Kleinfeld eventually became an official historical site, visited by school groups and tourists who wanted to learn about this remarkable story of wartime compassion. A small plaque was installed, written in both German and English, that simply stated, "On this site in April 1945, former enemies became friends through an act of humanity that transcended the divisions of war." But for Anna and Hope, and for Richard Collins and his family, the real significance of that day was not in its symbolic value or historical importance. It was in the simple, profound truth it demonstrated, that even in humanity's darkest hours, individuals can choose to act with kindness, compassion, and grace. That choice, made by a few American soldiers in a small German village, had ripple effects that lasted for generations, creating bonds of friendship that helped heal the wounds of war and build a more peaceful world. The story reminds us that history is not just made by the decisions of politicians and generals, but by the everyday choices of ordinary people who decide to help rather than harm, to build bridges rather than walls, to see the humanity in those who might be considered enemies. In the end, it was not the grand strategies or sweeping movements that mattered most, but the simple act of one person helping another in a moment of desperate need. Years later, when Hope was 15 years old, she would experience firsthand the continuing ripple effects of her birth story. The year was 1960, and tensions between East and West Germany were escalating rapidly. The Berlin Wall had not yet been built, but the Cold War was creating new divisions that threatened to tear apart the fragile peace that had been established after the Second World War. Anna had moved to Munich by this time, seeking better opportunities for herself and hope in the larger city. She had found work with the American consulate, using her language skills and cultural knowledge to help facilitate communication between American diplomats and German officials. It was meaningful work that allowed her to continue building bridges between the two countries that had given her so much. Hope attended an international school in Munich, where she studied alongside children from many different countries. Her unique background, growing up with stories of American kindness and German resilience, made her something of a natural mediator among her classmates. When tensions arose between students from different nations, Hope often found herself helping them understand each other's perspectives. One autumn day, Hope's class was assigned a project about the Second World War. Students were required to interview someone who had lived through the conflict and present their findings to the class. While most of her classmates interviewed grandparents or family friends about battles and bombing raids, Hope had something different in mind. She approached her teacher, Mrs. Davidson, an American woman who had come to Germany as part of a cultural exchange program. "I would like to do something special for my project," Hope said in perfect English. "I want to tell the story of my birth, but I want to do more than just tell it. I want to try to find the soldiers who were there." Mrs. Davidson was intrigued by the idea, but concerned about the practicality. "Hope, that was 15 years ago, and those men could be anywhere in America now. How would you even begin to look for them?" Hope had been thinking about this problem for weeks. "My mother has kept all the letters from Lieutenant Collins." He mentioned the names of some of the other soldiers in his letters. "And I know they were part of the 3rd Army, 12th Corps. Maybe we could contact the American Military Archives?" Mrs. Davidson was impressed by Hope's research initiative and agreed to help her with the project. Together, they drafted letters to the U.S. Army Records Office, explaining Hope's story and requesting assistance in locating the soldiers who had been present at her birth. The response came faster than they had expected. Not only did the Army have records of Collins's unit and the soldiers who had been in Kleinfeld that day, but several of them had actually written reports about the incident that were now part of the official military archives. The birth of a German baby assisted by American soldiers had been unusual enough to warrant documentation, and those documents had been preserved. More remarkably, the Army was able to provide current contact information for several of the soldiers, including Collins himself, who was now working as a high school principal in Columbus, Ohio. Sergeant Martinez had become a police officer in San Antonio, Texas. Private Roberts was attending college on the GI Bill and planned to become a teacher. Helen Thompson had continued her nursing career and was now working at a veterans hospital in Chicago. Hope was thrilled by this information, but she also felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of reaching out to these people who had played such a crucial role in her life. With Anna's encouragement and Mrs. Davidson's help, she began writing letters to Grass, each of them explaining who she was and inviting them to share their memories of that day in April 1945. The responses that came back were filled with warmth, emotion, and vivid recollections of the day that had clearly remained meaningful to all of them. Collins wrote that he thought about Hope and Anna often, especially whenever he heard news about Germany. He said that witnessing Hope's birth had been one of the most profound experiences of his military service, and that it had shaped his views about the importance of international understanding and cooperation. Sergeant Martinez wrote that he had told the story of Hope's birth to his own children many times, using it as an example of how people could choose to do the right thing even in difficult circumstances. He said that the memory of standing guard outside that barn while new life came into the world sustained him through some of the darkest moments of his own life. Helen Thompson's letter was particularly moving. She wrote that helping to deliver Hope had been one of the most meaningful moments of her nursing career, and that she had often thought about the little girl who had been born in such extraordinary circumstances. She said that she had always wondered how Hope had grown up and what kind of person she had become. Private Robert Strow, now in his mid-30s and working as an elementary school teacher, wrote that the experience in Kleinfeld had influenced his decision to go into education. He said that he wanted to help young people understand that the world was full of possibilities for cooperation and friendship, even between people who might seem very different from each other. The letters led to an extraordinary reunion that was arranged for the summer of 1961. Collins, Martinez, Thompson, and Roberts all made plans to travel to Germany to meet Hope and Anna again. The American consulate, where Anna worked, offered to help coordinate the visit and even suggested that it might serve as a positive example of German-American friendship during a time when such examples were desperately needed. The reunion took place in Munich. But the group also made a pilgrimage back to Kleinfeld to visit the barn where Hope had been born. The village had changed significantly in the 16 years since the war's end. It was now prosperous and modern, with, quote, new houses, paved roads, and all the amenities of post-war reconstruction. But the barn remained, carefully preserved by the local community as a reminder of the day when enemies had become friends. Standing in that barn again, the now middle-aged soldiers were struck by how small and simple it seemed compared to their memories. But Hope, seeing it for the first time as a young woman who could understand its significance, was deeply moved by the physical connection to her own origins. "This is where it all began," she said quietly, speaking in English to the assembled group. "Not just my life, but this whole idea that people can choose to help each other instead of hurting each other." Collins, now graying and wearing civilian clothes instead of a military uniform, nodded thoughtfully. "It's strange to be back here. In some ways, it feels like it was yesterday. In other ways, it feels like a lifetime ago." Helen Thompson, her hair now silver but her eyes still sharp and kind, examined the barn with professional interest. "We made this work with so little equipment, so few supplies. But we had the most important thing: the determination to help." The reunion was covered by local newspapers and even attracted attention from international media. The story of the German baby delivered by American soldiers and their reunion 16 years later was seen as a powerful symbol of reconciliation and friendship between former enemies. But for Hope, the most meaningful part of the reunion was the opportunity to hear first-hand accounts of her birth from the people who had been there. Each person remembered different details, and together their stories created a complete picture of that day that was richer and more complex than anything Anna had been able to tell her. She learned that Private Roberts had been so nervous about the birth that he had paced back and forth outside the barn until Sergeant Martinez had ordered him to stand still. She learned that Helen Thompson had been genuinely worried about complications, given the limited medical equipment available, and had prayed silently throughout the entire delivery. She learned that Collins had written a long letter to his wife immediately after Hope's birth, describing the experience as one of the most moving of his entire life. These details brought the story to life in a way that transformed Hope's understanding of her own origins. She began to see her birth not just as a personal milestone, but as a moment when several individuals had made conscious choices to act with compassion and courage. The reunion also planted the seeds for a project that would become Hope's life work. Inspired by the connections she had rediscovered with the Americans who had helped her into the world, she began to envision a program that would bring together veterans and civilians from different countries to share their stories and build understanding across national boundaries. With the help of Mrs. Davidson and the support of the American consulate, Hope began developing what would eventually become the International Friendship Project. The program was designed to facilitate meetings between former enemies, to create opportunities for people to share their experiences and learn from each other's perspectives. The project's first major event was held in Munich in 1962, bringing together German and American veterans of the Second World War for a series of discussions and cultural exchanges. The response was overwhelming, with veterans from both countries expressing gratitude for the opportunity to meet their former opponents as human beings rather than enemies. One of the most powerful moments of that first gathering came when a German veteran named Klaus Weber met an American pilot named David Harrison, who had been shot down over Germany in 1944. Weber had been part of the ground crew that captured Harrison, and both men had carried difficult memories of that encounter for nearly 20 years. During their conversation, mediated by Hope, the two men were able to discuss their experiences honestly and openly. Weber explained that he had been terrified during the war, afraid that he would be killed or that his family would be harmed by bombing raids. Harrison described his own fear during his months as a prisoner of war, and his gradual realization that his German captors were human beings with their own fears and concerns. By the end of their conversation, both men were in tears, not from sadness, but from relief at finally being able to put their wartime experiences into a broader context of shared humanity. They became friends and continued to correspond for many years afterward, each helping the other to heal from the trauma of war. Stories like this convinced Hope that her project was addressing a real need, not just among veterans, but among all people who had been affected by conflict and division. She expanded the program to include civilians who had lived through the war, refugees who had been displaced by the fighting, and even young people who had grown up in the shadow of the conflict. The International Friendship Project began to attract attention from other countries and other conflicts. Veterans of the Korean War, the conflict in Vietnam that was just beginning to escalate, and even older conflicts dating back to the First World War began to participate in the program. Hope found herself becoming something of an expert in the psychology of reconciliation, studying how people could move beyond hatred and fear to build genuine understanding and friendship. She collaborated with psychologists, historians, and political scientists to develop more effective methods for facilitating these kinds of connections. One of her most important insights was that personal stories were far more powerful than abstract discussions of politics or history. When people shared their individual experiences of war, loss, and survival, they created emotional connections that transcended the larger narratives that had divided them. This insight led to the development of the Story Bridge methodology, which became the cornerstone of the International Friendship Project. Participants were encouraged to share personal stories from their own experiences, while listeners were trained to ask questions and respond in ways that built empathy and understanding. The success of the Story Bridge approach attracted attention from international organizations working on conflict resolution and peacebuilding. Hope was invited to speak at conferences, to train facilitators in other countries, and to adapt her methods for use in different cultural contexts. By 1965, when Hope was 20 years old, the International Friendship Project had facilitated connections between thousands of people from dozens of countries. The program had expanded beyond its original focus on German-American relations to include participants from across Europe, Asia, and other regions affected by the Second World War. Hope's work also caught the attention of American universities, and she was offered scholarships to study international relations and conflict resolution in the United States. The opportunity to live in America, the country of the soldiers who had helped her into the world, was too good to pass up. She enrolled at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., where she studied under some of the leading experts in international relations and diplomacy. Her professors were impressed by her practical experience with reconciliation work and encouraged her to pursue graduate studies that would allow her to develop her ideas further. During her time in America, Hope maintained her correspondence with Collins, Martinez, Thompson, and Roberts, all of whom had become something like extended family to her. She visited Collins and his family in Ohio, where she met his daughter Anna, now a college student herself, majoring in German literature. The two young women, both named for people on the other side of the Atlantic, became close friends despite their different backgrounds. Anna Collins had grown up hearing stories about the German baby her father had helped deliver, while Hope had grown up hearing stories about the kind American soldiers who had helped her mother. Their friendship became another example of how the connections forged on that day in April 1945 continued to create new relationships and opportunities for understanding. Anna Collins eventually became a German language teacher and spent several years working in Germany as part of a cultural exchange program. Hope's graduate studies at Georgetown focused on the role of personal relationships in international diplomacy. Her thesis examined how individual connections between people from different countries could influence broader political relationships and contribute to conflict prevention. The research required her to study historical examples of friendship and cooperation across national boundaries, as well as contemporary efforts to build understanding between former enemies. She interviewed diplomats, peace activists, veterans, and ordinary citizens who had participated in various reconciliation programs. One of her most significant discoveries was that successful reconciliation almost always required what she termed bridge individuals, people who had personal connections to multiple sides of a conflict and could therefore serve as credible messengers between different groups. Hope realized that she herself had become such a bridge individual, with personal connections to both German and American communities, and a life story that embodied the possibility of friendship between former Balsine enemies. This realization helped her understand that her work was not just about facilitating connections between other people, but about using her own unique position to build understanding at a larger scale. After completing her graduate studies, Hope was offered a position with the State Department's Cultural Affairs Office, where she would be responsible for developing programs to strengthen relationships between the United States and its European allies. The job would allow her to apply her reconciliation methods on a larger scale and to influence official government policy. Her first major assignment was to develop a program for German-American youth exchanges that would give young people from both countries the opportunity to live with families and attend schools in the other country. The program was designed to create lasting personal connections that would strengthen the alliance between the two nations for generations to come. Hope drew on her experience with the International Friendship Project to design exchange programs that emphasized personal storytelling and cultural immersion rather than formal academic study. Participants were encouraged to live with host families, to participate in community activities, and to develop genuine friendships with their peers. The German-American Youth Exchange Program became a model for similar programs with other countries. Hope's methods were adapted for use with French, British, Italian, and eventually Japanese participants, creating a network of international connections that strengthened America's alliances around the world. But even as her work expanded to include many different countries and cultures, Hope never forgot the specific story of her own birth and the lessons it had taught her about the power of individual kindness to transcend political divisions. In 1970, 25 years after her birth, Hope organized a special anniversary commemoration in Kleinfeld. Collins, Martinez, Thompson, and Roberts all returned to Germany for the event, along with their families and dozens of other people whose lives had been touched by the story. The commemoration included the dedication of a small memorial garden adjacent to the barn where Hope had been born. The garden featured flowers and plants from both Germany and America, symbolizing the friendship that had grown from the seeds planted on that April day in 1945. During the dedication ceremony, Hope spoke about the continuing relevance of her birth story in a world that still struggled with conflict and division. The Vietnam War was raging, the Cold War continued to divide Europe, and new conflicts were emerging in other parts of the world. "The lesson of my birth," Hope said to the assembled crowd, "is not that war can be avoided or that all conflicts can be resolved through goodwill. The lesson is that individual human beings always have the choice to act with compassion rather than cruelty, to help rather than harm, to build bridges rather than walls." She continued, "The American soldiers who helped me into this world could have chosen differently. They could have followed orders mechanically, treating my mother as just another enemy civilian to be processed and moved along. Instead, they chose to see her as a person in need of help, and they responded with generosity and kindness." The anniversary commemoration attracted international media attention and helped spread awareness of Hope's work to a broader audience. She began receiving invitations to speak at universities, conferences, and international organizations around the world. Her message was always essentially the same: that lasting peace could not be imposed from above by governments or international institutions, but had to be built from below through personal connections between individuals who chose to see each other as human beings rather than enemies. This message resonated particularly strongly with young people who had grown up during the Cold War and were searching for alternatives to the ideological divisions that seemed to dominate international relations. Hope found herself becoming something of a voice for a generation that believed in the possibility of a more cooperative and peaceful world. During the 1970s, Hope's work expanded to include conflict resolution in regions beyond Europe and North America. She was invited to facilitate dialogue between participants in conflicts in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Africa, always adapting her story bridge methodology to local cultural contexts. One of her most challenging assignments came in 1975, when she was asked to help facilitate discussions between Israeli and Palestinian participants in a conference on Middle Eastern reconciliation. The conflict between these two peoples was still relatively young compared to the historical animosity between Germany and the United States, but it was already deeply entrenched and emotionally charged. Hope spent months preparing for the conference, studying the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and consulting with experts on Middle Eastern culture and politics. She knew that her methods, which had been developed primarily in the context of post-war European reconciliation, would need to be significantly adapted for use in this very different situation. The conference was held in Switzerland and included participants from both sides of the conflict, as well as observers from various international organizations. Hope's role was to facilitate small group discussions using her story bridge methodology, helping participants share personal experiences and develop empathy for each other's perspectives. The sessions were emotionally intense and often difficult. Participants brought deep-seated grievances and traumatic memories that made it challenging for them to see each other as anything other than enemies. But gradually, as people shared their personal stories of loss, displacement, and survival, connections began to emerge. One particularly powerful moment came when an Israeli woman named Sarah shared the story of her family's escape from Europe during the Holocaust, while a Palestinian man named Ahmed described his family's displacement from their village during the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. Both stories involved the trauma of losing homes and being forced to start over in a new place, and the similarities helped both participants recognize their shared humanity. The conference did not resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, nor did Hope expect it to. But it did demonstrate that even in the most difficult and entrenched conflicts, individual human connections were possible when people were given the opportunity to share their stories and listen to each other with empathy and respect. Hope's experience in the Middle East confirmed her belief that reconciliation was a long-term process that required patience, persistence, and a willingness to work at the level of individual relationships rather than by grand political gestures. She began to develop what she called the pebble in the pond theory of peace building, the idea that small acts of understanding and friendship could create ripple effects that eventually influenced larger political and social changes. This theory was put to the test during the late 1970s and early 1980s, as Cold War tensions reached new heights and the possibility of nuclear conflict seemed very real. Hope found herself working with American and Soviet citizens who were trying to build personal connections across the ideological divide that separated their countries. The work was complicated by the fact that travel between the United States and Soviet Union was heavily restricted, and both governments viewed citizen-to-citizen exchanges with suspicion. But Hope was able to facilitate some limited connections through cultural and academic exchanges, always emphasizing the personal rather than the political dimensions of these relationships. One of her most successful projects during this period was a pen pal program that connected American and Soviet children through letters that were carefully monitored by both governments but still allowed for genuine personal communication. The children shared information about their daily lives, their families, their hobbies, and their dreams for the future, creating connections that transcended the political hostility between their countries. Hope also worked with scientists, artists, and other professionals who were able to travel between the two countries for conferences and exchanges. She helped them understand how their professional relationships could contribute to broader understanding between their peoples, and she trained them in techniques for building personal connections despite language and cultural barriers. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the subsequent end of the Cold War vindicated Hope's belief in the power of personal connections to influence larger political changes. While she certainly could not claim credit for these momentous developments, she knew that the thousands of individual relationships that had been built between Americans and Europeans over the previous decades had contributed to an atmosphere that made peaceful change possible. As the world entered the 1990s, Hope found herself in demand as a consultant on post-conflict reconciliation in regions that were emerging from decades of division and hostility. She worked with organizations in Eastern Europe, South Africa, and other regions where societies were trying to heal from the wounds of war and oppression. Her methods continued to evolve as she learned from each new context, but the core principles remained the same. The importance of personal storytelling, the power of empathy to bridge differences, and the belief that individual choices could create larger social changes. In 1995, 50 years after her birth, Hope published a book called The Bridge of Stories, Personal Narrative and International Reconciliation. The book combined her theoretical insights about reconciliation with dozens of personal stories from participants in her various programs over the years. The book became a bestseller and established Hope as one of the leading voices in the field of conflict resolution and peace-building. She was invited to lecture at universities around the world and to consult with international organizations working on reconciliation in various regions. But even as her work gained international recognition, Hope never forgot the simple story of her own birth and the lessons it had taught her about the power of individual kindness to transcend political divisions. She continued to return to Kleinfeld regularly, maintaining the memorial garden and using the barn as a venue for workshops and training sessions. The barn had become something of a pilgrimage site for people interested in reconciliation and peace-building. Visitors came from around the world to hear the story of Hope's birth and to learn about the methods that had grown out of that experience. Anna Müller, now in her 70s, remained active in the International Friendship Project and often spoke to visitors about her experience during the war and her gratitude to the American soldiers who had helped her. Daughter, into the world. Her presence provided a living connection to the events of April 1945 and helped visitors understand the human dimension of historical events. Lieutenant Richard Collins had passed away in 1992, but his family continued to be involved in Hope's work. His daughter Anna Collins had become a prominent advocate for international education and cultural exchange, carrying on her father's legacy of building bridges between nations. Sergeant Martinez, Helen Thompson, and Private Roberts had all remained in touch with Hope throughout their lives. And their stories of that day in April 1945 had become an integral part of the narrative that Hope shared with audiences around the world. As the 20th century drew to a close, Hope reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with her birth in a barn in occupied Germany. From those humble and dangerous beginnings, she had built a life dedicated to proving that her father's choice to help an enemy woman in labor had been not just an act of individual kindness, but a symbol of humanity's capacity to choose cooperation over conflict. The story of Hope's birth had become more than just a personal narrative. It had become a teaching tool, a source of inspiration, and a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, individual human beings could choose to act with compassion and courage. As Hope looked toward the new millennium, she knew that the world would continue to face conflicts and divisions that would test humanity's capacity for understanding and reconciliation. But she also knew that the example set by those American soldiers in April 1945 would continue to inspire people to make the choice to help rather than harm, to build rather than destroy, to see the humanity in those who might be considered enemies. The legacy of that day in the barn would live on, not just in the stories and programs that Hope had created, but in the countless individual choices that people would make in the years to come to extend kindness across boundaries of nationality, ideology, and history. In the end, that was the most important lesson of all. That peace was not something that could be imposed from above, but something that had to be built. One relationship, one story, one act of kindness at a time. Anna Müller's daughter Hope was born into a world at war, but she was brought into life by people who chose peace. That choice, and the friendship it created, became a living testament to the possibility that people from different nations, cultures, and backgrounds can work together to build a better future for all humanity. The legacy of that April day in 1945 continues to inspire people around the world to choose compassion over conflict, understanding over hatred, and hope over despair.